Welcome to the TED Interview. I'm your host, Stephen Johnson. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that one of the things we really try to embrace here is having guests from a wide range of disciplines. I mean, just this season alone, we've had a novelist, a cosmologist, a TV sitcom writer, a surgeon, and a cartoonist. Intellectual diversity and multidisciplinary thinking, those are core values for us. But there's another related kind of diversity that has become an important part of the conversation in recent years, and that's neurodiversity. The idea that there are a wide range of brains out there, and some excel at some tasks but struggle with others. Neurodiversity is often associated with people who are autistic, who have been historically marginalized, but who often possess enormous gifts when tackling certain kinds of problems. And I think it's fair to say that over the past few decades, the most powerful and persuasive advocate for this new understanding of neurodiversity has been today's guest, the scientist and animal behaviorist Temple Grandin. Grandin began her career as a proponent for the humane treatment of livestock for slaughter, and has gone on to author more than 60 scientific papers on animal behavior. Grandin rose to fame in the autism community as one of the first individuals with autism to share their experiences and perspectives publicly, in books like 1995's Thinking in Pictures and her latest, Visual Thinking. Oliver Sacks wrote about her in the title essay from his classic book, An Anthropologist from Mars. Grandin is currently a faculty member in the College of Agricultural Sciences at Colorado State University. In 2010, Time magazine named her one of the most important 100 people of the year in the Heroes category, and she was the subject of an Emmy and Golden Globe winning biographical film, Temple Grandin, starring Claire Danes. Thinking Different with Temple Grandin. That's next on the TED Interview. Temple Grandin, welcome to the TED Interview.
Great to be here.
So we have just so many things to cover in our time together, so many interesting projects and books over the course of your career. I wanted to start with maybe the most recent one, which is a new book you have that has just come out called Visual Thinking. And it begins with two anecdotes of things you experienced relatively recently that kind of sparked the idea for this book. Can you walk us through those and explain what the significance of them really was to you at the time?
Well, I've been working on equipment design in the livestock industry for very long career. And in 2019, right before COVID hit, I went to 4 places that made me realize that we have a serious problem with skill loss. And there were 2 brand new state-of-the-art pork processing plants where all the equipment that's in that plant came from either Holland or Quebec. And then the next case was a poultry processing plant, brand new. And we built the building, but all of that equipment inside that building had been brought in 100 shipping containers. And then the real shocker was the Steve Jobs Theater. I got invited out to Apple to do a talk, and they have the structural glass walls in the mothership building. And I looked up who made the glass walls, and the company comes from Italy and Germany. So I stood in the middle of that building. I had an Apple ID around my neck, and I screamed, "We don't make it anymore." Yeah. So this was sort of like, wow, this is a problem. And I've been in the cattle industry for 50 years. And all of the big major meat companies I worked with had in-house engineering departments where they had big shops that the meat company owned and build all their specialized equipment. Well, 20, 25 years ago, they started phasing out in-house engineering. Worst thing they ever did. And they found that it was cheaper to just contract the work out. The other gigantic mistake that was made in our educational system was taking out all the hands-on classes like shop, welding, auto mechanics. Because I worked with a number of people that today would have been diagnosed autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD that had their own shops.
And so the argument here is that there is a certain kind of mind, really, that is extremely good at solving these, engineering problems, spatial geometric problems, dealing with complex equipment, and that we, in a sense, as a society, have not been elevating those thinking styles the way that we should. We've not been encouraging it.
Well, part of the problem is extreme algebra requirements and math requirements.
That is so interesting.
I cannot do higher math, period.
Yeah.
All the people I worked with that were inventing and patenting complicated mechanical equipment that was used across the industry, they couldn't do algebra either. But what's happening is our educational system is screening them out, because people that think the way I do have a really hard time with algebra because there's nothing to visualize.
I thought that point about algebra was really fascinating. And I think that the thing that we should stress to our listeners is, in a sense, your argument is that algebra is kind of this blocking effect in people progressing through high school, and that they actually, geometry and trig are actually easier for them because they're more spatial. Is that the idea?
Well, they're visual, but also I can relate trig to a suspension bridge. The trig function on the cables, or when you're sawing down a tree and which way it's going to fall. You see, but that's something where I can take that trig function and relate it back to an actual real thing.
Yeah.
Now, there's two types of visualization. There is the object visualizer. That's me, thinking in photorealistic pictures. And if you watch the HBO movie about me, it shows exactly how I think. It's a picture association. Then you have your more mathematical pattern thinker. This is the visual spatial, the typical student that's going to go the STEM route. Okay, those kids are not getting screened out, but the people getting screened out is me. And I don't know if I could graduate from high school today in California, for example. You see, the visual thinking that I do, it's a different kind of thinking process. You just see how a machine works. You come up with novel ideas for equipment. You go back and look at the old patents. I've been to the patent office. And when I was a child, I loved the book about famous inventors. And all of the devices were mechanical: a steamship, sewing machine, grain harvesting equipment. It would have been my kind of mind inventing that stuff.
I think that one of the things that is so striking that you mention in the new book, which really hit home to me, is the IKEA test in terms of kind of self-diagnosing where you are in the spectrum. And if you look at the kind of visual descriptions of how to assemble a piece of IKEA furniture and you're like, oh yeah, sure, exactly, I can see that, I can do that, then you're more of a visual thinker. I'm on the exact opposite spectrum. Like I'm the person in our household who never builds anything because I think I'm just a word person and I'm baffled by those diagrams. And it really is, you can feel it, just your brain struggles, in my case, to like make sense of spatial geometric forms on a page. And I can imagine it just must feel completely different in another kind of mind.
Well, on something like putting together the IKEA stuff, I'd rather look at the diagrams.
Yeah. I
get lost in the wording. Now, you see Betsy Lerner, my co-author on visual thinking, we've had big discussions how she thinks differently than I do. Boy, does she know how to organize my stuff. The problem is I'm an associational thinker. I just got a paper back now from journal article reviewers, and they were criticizing my writing. One reviewer was saying I was jumping from one idea to another. But you see, that's associational thinking. And then I got to smooth it out and put a connector in it. So I'm going to be spending some time reading that paper out loud.
I want to go back a little bit to your biography. At what point did you realize that you had a gift for thinking visually rather than just something that seemed to not work very well?
Well, I didn't even know when I was in my 20s that other people thought in words. I did not know that. I thought everybody thought the way I did. Because if I ask you to visualize, shouldn't ask you to visualize. I ask you, access your memory on church steeples. How do they come into your mind? I was shocked when a speech therapist just got this extremely vague, pointy thing. Almost no image at all. So what I do is I start getting like PowerPoint slides of actual individual churches. It's specific. The concept of what a steeple is specific. Now, there's a reason for asking for steeples, because if I ask you house or dog, most people will visualize their own home or their own dog. But I ask you something you don't own. And then there's a lot of people that are mixtures. They'll get an image, there'll be more detail, but it's still generalized. And that was a shock.
If you could design the ideal educational system for encouraging people who think the way that you do and creating and cultivating their talents, would there be a kind of an early diagnosis of this that would put them on a separate track?
I don't want to diagnose anything.
Right.
I just want to expose them. Let's get these classes and make sure you have these classes in school. Music, theater, cooking, sewing, woodworking, metal shop, welding, auto mechanics, drawing, technical drawings. You just expose them. And my ability in art showed up really young. And my mother encouraged my art. Because my kind of mind, we cannot do algebra. We're good at art, and we're also good at mechanics. Art and mechanics actually go together. Now, I was exposed as a young child to piano lessons and playing a little flute. I couldn't figure out how to play the flute. But some other child will pick up that flute and play it. You see, it's really important to get exposed to a lot of things. And this is especially important for some of the individuals who are not the more typical mixtures of some of these different kinds of thinking. But for the extreme thinkers, yes, and I was exposed to sports and I was kind of klutzy. Later on, I was exposed to the same computer that Bill Gates was exposed to, the exact same computer. I had free access to it. Took a programming class, had to drop it. Bill Gates took off on it. When I look at how people get into a lot of careers, it starts with exposure and then mentoring.
One key pivotal moment in your life in terms of exposing yourself to new experiences was the introduction of animals, livestock. When you were in your teens, was it, when you first kind of went to a ranch? Was there an immediate sense of connection that you felt towards the animals on that ranch?
Well, I went to boarding school. I had adolescence, absolutely my horrible time. I got bullied and stuff. And the only places I was not bullied was horseback riding with other people. I was a terrible student. They put me in charge of the horse barn. I cleaned 9 stalls every day. I took care of the horses. They had a 12-cow dairy there where I learned how to milk cows, and you see, that's exposure. I came from a non-ag background. And then when I was in my teens, I also had a chance to go to my aunt's ranch, and I really liked the West, and I was scared to go. My mother said, you can go for a week or you can go all summer. I got out there, loved it, stayed all summer.
Why do you think that your brain, the way it is configured, has such a immediate affinity with animals?
Animals live in a sensory-based world. I tell people, you want to understand animals, get away from verbal language. And I have a chapter in the visual thinking book on consciousness in animals. And there's some people that don't think animals are conscious. And I think it gets down to if you think totally in words, you might have a hard time imagining that your dog can actually think because he doesn't have words. But since I'm already a visual thinker, to me, it's ridiculous to think a dog is not conscious. And it's a sensory-based world. I see people yanking their dog away from the tree it wants to smell. Well, their smell is stronger than ours. And I just read this fascinating article and saw a dog brain scan where there's a gigantic trunk line from the nose to the visual cortex. This is research from Cornell. I'm going, trippy. Smell pictures? Trippy. And I'm trying to imagine now when I see somebody jerking that dog away from that bush, I say you're depriving him of his world.
We had as a guest earlier this season, Ed Young, who wrote a wonderful book, An Immense World, about dog and
Yes.
other animal senses. And one of the points that I thought was so mind-blowing is I'd understood the idea that dogs have a three-dimensional sense of smell that they can sense,
Yeah.
where the smell is. But they also have a time-based sense of smell, which they get the sense of like, oh, this smell was from a dog who was here probably about 20 minutes ago.
Yep.
We have a dog in New York City, and I just think the smell experience as he walks down the sidewalk with so many thousands of other dogs who peed on that exact part of the sidewalk.
That's right. Exactly. and he's got to smell every one of them and let him smell it.
Your career has been so interesting in that you've had this enormous impact in getting people to think about autism and Asperger's differently and the visual style of thinking. But you've also been a pioneer in the design of animal livestock handling facilities. How did you get to that career path originally?
Well, I learned how to work at a young age. And even though I wasn't studying when I went to the boarding school, I learned how to work. 3 years of horse barn management. I also started a little sign painting business. First sign I ever sold was for a hairdressing salon. And I had to paint a sign that a salon would want. So I started out this little bitty sign painting business. And then I had to learn how to read and draw blueprints. And for a year and a half, I worked for a big feedlot construction company. And they had a draftsman there named Davey, and I think he was on the spectrum. And we were best buds. And I watched how he drew things. But I had to learn how to read drawings. So I made my own self-made internship over at the local Swift plant, and they let me borrow a beautiful set of hand-done drawings, very detailed. And I walked around in that plant for 2 days until every column, every door, every piece of equipment, I could look at the drawing and then look at the thing. That's gradually how I learned. Now, another thing I did, there's a very important scene in the HBO movie where I go up to the editor of the Farmer Ranchman magazine and get his card. Because I knew if I wrote for that magazine, that would help my career. I wrote about my projects. And I just wrote how to design them, how to build them. It was a lot of how-to information. And that kind of writing I'm good at because I narrate the thing I'm seeing in my mind. So it just started out very slowly, one little project at a time, starting with a paint a sign for a hairdressing salon. And then my biggest project, I learned to sell my work, and my big breakthrough was landing Cargill. This was back in the late 80s, and I sent a great big fold-out drawing that had a Cargill. Some trade magazine articles, a couple of pages full of pictures, nice cover letter, nice brochure, and I landed my first Cargill job.
We should explain to our listeners what is Cargill?
Cargill is one of the biggest beef plants and companies in the world.
Right.
I mean, this was landing a big one.
You have some amazing stories about how your particular perspective on the world has enabled you to understand problems that are in existing facilities, in a sense, because you're looking at it from the perspective of the animal itself. Can you tell us examples of how that?
Oh, animals are afraid of stuff we don't notice. Now, being a visual thinker helped me because animals live in a sensory-based world. What is it seeing, smelling, hearing? I would look at things like shadows that would make cattle stop and refuse to walk through a chute. Other people weren't seeing that. I just worked on an equipment startup this spring, and they had a big shadow in there that appeared at 3:30 in the afternoon. I call it the spider monster. And it looked like, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, that big shadow was not in the facility. Everything was working fine. 3:30 in the afternoon, the shadow monster appeared. These Angus cattle decided they weren't going to walk over it. And I said, we're going to have to build a roof over this. Only way to get rid of the shadow monster. And the thing I'm finding is that trying to train people to see these things. Some people have a hard time with it. I explained to them, what you got to do is watch your cattle, bring them up really calmly, and they'll look right at stuff they don't like a coat on a fence, a vehicle parked next to a facility. This same facility at night, they were having some problems. And I said, now bring your cattle up nice and calm and look at where he stops, where the lead steer stops and what he looks at. And there was a weird LED light on the side of the building. They got rid of that. And I guess I have job security because I point these things out and then they go, oh, duh.
There seems to be a growing argument that you've been part of. There's also been books by people like Simon Baron-Cohen about this,
Yes,
about
yes.
the basically the long kind of human history of what Baron-Cohen argues, autistic people driving innovations in engineering and planning and complex mechanical devices that have been crucial to human progress. We've depended on people who have these kinds of cognitive skills without kind of realizing it over that whole period. Is that something you agree with?
One of the other things I discussed in the book is things where a visual thinker like me could have helped avoid a disaster like Fukushima. Because what I've learned is mathematical engineers calculate risk. And in Fukushima, they did a fabulous job on making it earthquake-proof, making it shake-proof. And it shook and it shook and it shook during the earthquake. Everything's fine. But they hadn't visualized that they need to make it waterproof. Simple watertight doors would have solved it. Because 20 minutes later, when the shaking stopped, the tsunami breached the seawall, flooded the site. And what do you think happened to the electrically driven emergency cooling pump? Not going to run underwater. And how could you make that mistake? And what I've learned is the mathematician doesn't see it. Simple watertight doors, ancient primitive technology would have totally prevented that. I visited Cape Kennedy about 5 years ago. And I remember standing in front of the vehicle assembly building, and I got to go in it. Got to go on the roof too. It's really cool. And looking at that, I got really emotional. I said, that's the greatest thing our generation did. And I've been at autism meetings at Houston, and I've had retired NASA scientists come up to me. And yeah, I'm on the autism spectrum. I discovered that when the grandkids got diagnosed. I have granddads coming up to me all the time, discovering that they're on the autism spectrum, and they've got good jobs, pharmacy, accounting, engineering, lots of different good jobs.
Yeah. I remember years ago, I did a talk at Microsoft, and I believe that the previous speaker had been Oliver Sacks, who is an interesting figure in your life, which I want to ask you about. And he'd done a talk that was partially about Asperger's, and he basically said, I guarantee you 80% of the people in this room have Asperger's.
Yes, I would agree with that. I have been to the tech companies, and I would guess that a lot of those programmers are on the spectrum. It's interesting. People get locked into the label. I talked to two parents that had a really smart mathematics kid, be the visual spatial pattern thinker. And they were so locked into the label of autism, they didn't think to introduce programming to their kid. And I suggested that. And they go, oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, teach your kid to program. They were both programmers for a major tech company.
Taking it back to Oliver Sacks, he wrote about you in his classic book, An Anthropologist on Mars, which is your phrase, right? It's what you said to him about your own sense of what you were. How did you get in contact with Sacks? Like, what was the backstory there?
Well, he was researching autism, and so he wanted to, talk to me. And then they published the article in the New Yorker magazine, and then he put it in the book. Now, Oliver Sacks kind of got into my head totally emotionally. The thing's interesting is he's not a visual thinker, because when the fact checker called, he'd made very big mistakes in describing my house. I live in a condo where it's 3 apartments in a townhome. He had me in a single family house. No, that's not what I was living in. And in describing my squeeze machine, that was really messed up. But he described what it felt like. You see, when it came to feelings and stuff, he got into my head. And he's also a very, very kind person. After that, we became friends. He lived in New York. I'd come home for Christmas. We'd go and have dinner with Oliver Sacks. He's an extremely kind person.
Wow, that's amazing. We should, in case our listeners don't know, will you describe the squeeze machine? That's a wonderful...
Well, when I got into puberty, I started having horrible, horrible panic attacks. And when I went out to my aunt's ranch, they have this device called a cattle squeeze chute that you put the cattle in, and then panels, squeeze them on the side, hold them still for their vaccinations. And I watched some cattle go through that getting vaccinations. And I said, I got to try that. Maybe the pressure will calm me. And I found it did. So then I built a squeeze machine-like device for myself, and that helped calm down my anxiety. It also helped get me desensitized some of the touch. I couldn't stand having people touch me. And since I could control a squeeze machine, with a control valve, I could, get to where I could tolerate. Now I have real people hugging me. But sensory issues in autism are real. You can have problems with sound sensitivity, touch sensitivity. Some kids have visual sensitivity. And sometimes you can desensitize that by letting the kid control the noise. Just recently, I was in Nebraska doing a talk, and I had a shop teacher say, well, how can the autistic kid tolerate the noise of the tools? I said, what you need to do is have him go down to the shop when no one's around to embarrass him, and he can turn all the noisy stuff on and off where he or she controls the really noisy thing, like a drill or whatever it is. And if they can control turning that noisy tool on and off, then they can sometimes get tolerated.
Do you think that if you look back over the kind of the arc of your career, have we made progress in recognizing these different cognitive styles? You've done so much work advancing that cause. Do you think we are, obviously there's still a lot of work to do. We've talked about that, but do we have at least a better sensitivity to this as a society?
Well, I think it's still hard for people to understand it. We've done a much better job on early intervention for kids with speech delay. And then, of course, you have the Asperger's type of autism where they're just, socially awkward. And those people are working. They learn how to work at a young age. Now, where an autism diagnosis helps them later in life is with their relationships, like with their spouse. That's where it gives insight. But we're doing a worse job, I think, today on getting these fully verbal kids working. Because one of the problems is when they merged everything together, you've got Elon Musk, Einstein. Einstein didn't talk till age 3. He'd land in an autism program today. You've got, people that are super brilliant, like Einstein and Elon Musk at one end of the spectrum. Then you have severe autism, where somebody can't dress themselves, and we name it all the same thing. This is where the verbal thinker overgeneralizes. Verbal thinking tends to overgeneralize. Mathematical thinking and my kind of thinking, maybe we have too many details. But the verbal thinkers have a hard time getting away from the label.
So I guess my last question is just, I know there must be, given our audience, more than a few, 16-year-olds or young adults who are listening to you talk and thinking, she's describing my mind here.
Yep, that's right.
What is your advice for them?
You want to learn how to work. I want to see the young people get out there and be successful. I'm now in my 70s. And what am I going to work on now the most? I want to see these young people get out and get into a career that they're going to like. And it could be, if they're the visual, spatial, mathematical mind, it could be computer programming. But somebody has to introduce that. For my kind of mind, it could be mechanics or animals or art. And one of the biggest problems I'm seeing with a lot of young, fully verbal people with labels is they haven't learned any work skills. And this is where the parents get completely locked into the label. And they're afraid to let their kid run in a store and buy something. And then I talked to a lady, a really nice lady in Nebraska that worked on teaching life skills like shopping. She said she'd get big fights with parents that wanted to overprotect their kids. And it just drives me crazy as I go back and forth between the industrial world and the autism world. And I want to see kids get out there and be successful. So this goes back to what would I do to fix the schools? I want to put all the hands-on classes back in so that kids get a chance to try these different things. And that helped me, motivated me to study. As Mr. Carlock, my science teacher, gave me interesting projects like the optical illusion room. And that motivated me to study. But some of the funnest stuff I ever did is we'd sit around in the shop and we like to talk about how to build stuff and how stupid the suits are. Now, I don't talk about that way about suits now because I understand now the difference. Suits a verbal thinker. This is where the world really does need all the different kinds of minds. But the first step, and I talked to a lot of big corporations, is you've got to realize that different thinking exists and then learn how to use them in complementary manner and using those complementary skills together.
Well, Temple Grandin, you are a great inspiration to us all. Thank you for sharing your extraordinary mind with us today. And we've just really been delighted to have you on the show.
Okay, well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for the show today. The TED Interview is part of the TED Audio Collective. This episode was produced by Jordan Bailey and our managing producer, Wilson Sayre. The show is mixed by Erica Wong. Jimmy Gutierrez is our story editor. Fact-checking by Miri Jesutasan. Farah DeGrange is our project manager, and Dan O'Donnell is our executive producer. Special thanks to Constanza Giardo, Michelle Quint, Anna Phelan, and Rithu Jagannath. I'm your host, Stephen Johnson. For more info on my other projects, including my latest book, Extra Life, which is about to come out in a new edition for young readers, you can follow me on Twitter at Stephen B. Johnson or sign up for my Substack newsletter, Adjacent Possible.